Welcome to our Big Picture Policy Recommendations Roundtable. This is the second of two roundtables where we'll be sharing our learning from the ARI project. ARI is short for Allies to Refugee Integration, and it's a collaboration between OCASI and Refugee 613. And we're now in the final stages of a 3-year program funded by Service Delivery Improvement at IRCC. I want to start by introducing our team. So we'll start with Michelle.
Sure. Thank you, Barbara. My name is Michelle Ball, and I'm the project coordinator for ARI at OCASI. That's the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. And I am located presently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And I'm very glad to co-host today's roundtable with my colleague, Barbara. Thank you.
And my name is Barbara Nzigiye. I am the project coordinator for ARI at Refugee 613, and I'm currently located in Ottawa, commonly referred to as Ottawa, on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territories. So our agenda for today is quite simple. In our first half of the agenda, we'll have a quick overview of the project and our pilots. And then in the second half, we'll focus on the policy recommendations for all of our collaborators. We really want to create an interactive space today, so we encourage respectful discussion and dialogue. We're asking everyone to stay on mute during the presentation period, but we, of course, always encourage your cameras to be on because it's very pleasant to speak to faces. During the presentation portion of the session, we encourage you to leave us comments or questions in the chat, and we'll be pausing at various points for questions and discussion during the presentation. During the discussion period, we encourage you to either raise your hand to speak or submit a question via the chat. Okay, let's get going.
Awesome. So we wanted to start this roundtable getting a sense of who's in the room, if I could say that, and to know who's present today, because we have a lot of variety of folks who are showing up today, I think. So I'm going to launch a poll. If you've never done a Zoom poll, it's pretty simple. It's going to pop up on your screen, and I'm going to launch this right now. You should see a poll that says, I am attending this roundtable in my role as ... and you can select as many as apply to you, because sometimes you have multiple kind of roles and identities. So options include sponsor, sponsorship agreement holder, refugee, settlement worker frontline, or settlement agency management, researcher, government, and other. So I'll just wait a few more seconds for you to complete this. I see about 50 of you have, which is great. And then I will show it on my screen so you can see who's in the room. Okay. I think that's all of us. I'm going to end polling and share the results with you. You can see we have kind of a majority of folks who are either from a settlement agency in a management position or a sponsorship agreement holder. So that's great. That's kind of, who we were hoping to have in the room today is kind of organizational level learning. So that's awesome. We also have sponsors, settlement workers, and others. So welcome, everyone. Before we begin, we also wanted to get a sense of what you're hoping to learn today, because we're going to be sharing a lot of information, but we also hope, as Barbara said, to have some dialogue. So to get you used to chatting and to let us know where you're at, can you put in the chat, what's one thing you hope to learn from today's roundtable discussion? So some of you, like Bill, perhaps, is coming in maybe wondering, okay, what's today all about? Maybe some of you came with an agenda. This is what I want to learn. So feel free to just pop that in the chat, and I'll read a few of them out so we can see what you're hoping to get out of today. Or perhaps you have no expectations, which is also totally fine. I appreciate that. Amelia says how to collaborate efficiently and effectively with sponsors. That's awesome. I have to say, you'll hear the word collaborate today a lot. It is our favorite word. How to model the suggestions that we gave in Victoria. That's great. Thank you, Andrea. The policy recommendations. Laura Beth says how to connect sponsors with settlement agencies to kind of the practical level. Caitlin wants to learn more about the three-way partnership model. That's great. And I think I missed from Ranjit being an active supporter for LGBT refugees and newcomers. Yusra, learn about key findings. Awesome. So I see there's a few things you're hoping to get out of today, but we definitely are going to concentrate, as mentioned, on that kind of, what can we do? What are the policy kind of recommendations? And then also looking to the future. Today is about the future. How do we improve this relationship based on what we learned in our pilots? So thank you for participating in that. Feel free to keep popping those in so we can hear. And in the meantime, we'll move on with our presentation. So some of you are familiar with ARI, some of you might be new. So I do want to just take a few moments to give a bit of context about who we are and what we're about to share with you today. The Allies for Refugee Integration project began back in 2018 when OCASI and Refugee 613 were talking about how they were seeing a gap in understanding about how settlement worker and sponsor roles intersected on a practical level when it worked to supporting sponsored refugees. We saw there was sometimes duplication of efforts, and there was also confusion about whether sponsored refugees should be accessing formal services funded by IRCC and others. So the central goal of ARI was therefore to better understand the challenges and the opportunities for that closer collaboration. The goal is not to replace or to change the unique role of each player, but to streamline and enhance teamwork for the sake of the refugees. And I want to mention too, because it came up in our last roundtable, we are focused on Ontario because that is where our organizations mostly serve. And so therefore we tested it here, but we think it has, important national implications. And that's why we wanted anyone to attend this roundtable that might be interested. So we began with a research phase in 2018 to better define the problem that we were seeing and to kind of crowdsource those potential solutions. And we did do research with more than 250 stakeholders who shared their ideas about what they wanted to see to enhance that teamwork. We then did a series of collaborative design sessions across the province to design pilot prototypes that responded to those needs. So by 2020, we had partnered with agencies across Ontario to begin testing 2 ideas to evaluate its impact. And today, after more than a year of pilot testing, we're excited to share with you not only what we learned, but the recommendations that come directly from these pilots and what is suggested for the future. I'm talking a lot about pilots. So you can see here on the screen, we couldn't have done this without some amazing partnerships. And we really want to pause to thank them for the incredible work they did. And we're really excited to have 2 of our pilot agencies with us to share about their experiences later on today. So welcome Anna and Laura who are here with us. But we'd like to thank Catholic Cross Cultural Services, the YMCA of Three Rivers and Mennonite Central Committee of Ontario, YMCA of Southwestern Ontario and the Diocese of London Refugee Ministries, and Immigrant Services Kingston and area. They worked really hard over the last year to test these ideas, adjust to a challenging year, and they did a really amazing job, as you're about to see. So I'll pass it over to Barbara to talk about the pilots in more detail, what we tested and what we learned.
Okay, so let's talk about our pilots. As Michelle just mentioned, we chose our top 2 ideas to pilot across Ontario in 2020, and I'm just going to give you a quick overview. So our first idea was the intentional connection pilots. Through formal partnerships between settlement providing organizations, SPOs, and settlement agreement holders, SAS, we connected sponsors and refugees with a settlement worker both pre and post arrival to discuss roles and align their efforts. We tested this intentional connection pilot in 3 locations, connecting 23 sponsor groups, 68 refugees, and 5 settlement workers. The practice really boiled down to 3 stages. The first one was the pre-arrival stage. This was an initial meeting between sponsors and settlement workers, between the sponsor and the settlement worker for role division and orientation to the services available. The second was the post-arrival stage. In this stage, the refugee and the sponsor met with the settlement worker for orientation, establishing that 3-way connection that we will be talking about and keep talking about. The last stage is ongoing services. This is where services were provided as needed and in a more sustained manner. And we had the usual confidential intakes for refugees, but with the sponsors looped in requests and able to access settlement workers if they had questions or inquiries. What did we hear from our stakeholders about their experiences with these pilots? Refugees appreciated knowing where to get support, especially in their language, for documents, and more especially during the pandemic that we are currently living through. Settlement workers appreciated getting to know information about their clients in advance and being able to learn about the roles of sponsors and build trust with them to work better together. Sponsors appreciated knowing they had a person who was available to them to access up-to-date information instead of struggling to navigate services. And pilot agencies, so SAS and SPOs, appreciated the seamless referrals and cooperation behind the scenes, on managing cases and joint activities such as orientations. We have a quote here from a sponsor that kind of talks about their experience. This connection to a settlement worker provides a linkage to help on that journey for a newcomer towards independence. Our second idea was the knowledge exchange pilot. This pilot brought together sponsors, settlement staff, and refugees for virtual discussions and information sharing sessions. We had 70 people participating in 5 events led by our pilot partners at Immigration Services, Kingston and area, covering topics based on needs assessments, including settlement access, mental health, and housing. We focused on them being a true exchange with sponsors and refugees, and settlement presenting their experiences as experts in their field. Michelle?
Am I the only one having trouble hearing Barbara? Sorry, maybe mention in the chat if others have had her freeze.
Did I freeze? No, I think Michelle might have frozen. That's okay. The joys of digital work. I think Michelle is having some connectivity issues. So I'll just keep going and then hopefully she can join us again once she is able to. Perfect. So continuing on the knowledge exchange pilot, 90% of attendees shared that 90% of the attendees surveyed shared that the event was very or somewhat helpful in increasing their understanding of resources available locally. The agencies felt that they were more responsive to refugees, and this really built stronger partnerships within and beyond the settlement sector. Partnerships included health, so there was a new long-term partnership with a local SA through the pilot community approach that emerged. To summarize, we had these overall themes for success. The first one was proactive connection. The timely and early connections of refugees and sponsors to a service provider made it easier for everyone to be on the same page and get information as they needed it at the right time. Also, one place to access information was really key to the success of the work done. Sponsors and refugees wanted one place to access the expert information of settlement rather than searching across multiple agencies and having to do that research by themselves. The third theme was organizational level cooperation. So organizational level cooperation between SAWS and SPOS, they reported the most impactful change for them was the benefit of ongoing collaboration. And for more on these details, we'll be sharing the recording from last week and just the details that we shared there. So we're very excited to have two pilot representatives joining us to share their experiences of this collaboration on the ground. They're here to share the benefits, the challenges, and of course, their advice for others on how to better work together. We're gonna start with Anna. Anna is an immigrant service leader from the YMCA of Three Rivers. Thank you, Anna, for joining us today. And I will mute myself and let you speak now.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for that introduction. I hope Michelle was able to get her connectivity back too. Welcome everybody to our meeting, and we're so happy to be invited and to be sharing our experiences from this very successful project. So in early 2020, it might have been the end of 2019, so pre-COVID, before that big thing called COVID happened, YMCA of Three Rivers Immigrant Services, which is a settlement agency in the region of Waterloo, covering Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, Stratford, and Guelph, together with our local SAW, Mennonite Central Committee, were approved for participation on this case management pilot project together with OCASI and ARI, and we're very happy to hear that news. Thank you very much for allowing us that luxury of participating in this pilot. So both of our organizations, we came into this project with an understanding of what Barbara and with some understanding of what Barbara and Michelle were highlighting in their part of the presentation as to how important it is for that early introduction of the privately sponsored refugee, the settlement services to happen, as well as how important it is for the settlement agency, the SAW, the private sponsorship group to work together to support private sponsors, newcomers, and all of that together, and also having one point of contact at each agency that would be coordinating those collaborative efforts, understanding the importance of all of that, and hoping for much better outcomes for the newcomers and PSR clients who participated in that pilot model. So the model that we were testing was the one that included pre-arrival meetings with sponsors, settlement, SAW, review the roles and responsibilities, and to create what we called collaborative action plan. So we created some tools for this pilot specifically, and one of them was that collaborative action plan, which basically is a version of needs assessment, but those that are discussed together with the roles and responsibilities in the multi-agency, kind of group scenario. Then there was a then there was a post-arrival meeting, an orientation meeting with the newcomer, sponsors, and settlement workers. Then the next stage of the model was to have a YMCA intake, which is a one-on-one of the settlement worker with the newcomer to discuss the needs more deeply, to understand what are the unique needs of that client or that family, and to set goals, settlement goals for the family or for that client. And then there was ongoing services and supports that included frequent check-ins with the clients. And then the final stage of the model was evaluation to identify if our model that we were applying was effective and if our approach was working for the clients. So as we know, COVID happened in between us being selected to participate in that pilot and kind of the implementation stage of it. So a certain pivoting had to happen in between to to reflect the changes. And so the things that we did, but also from the SAW and from the SPO perspective, understanding that despite the borders being closed, some refugees were still arriving, and those people who were arriving would need even more help than before COVID because of the unique situation that we were all in. So the pivoting that happened specifically for our project was the decision that was made between the SAW, the SPO, and the OCASI and ARI to include month 13 clients, and also to allow for the services to be provided online when the province was in the province-wide shutdown, as well as for the hybrid model when the conditions were okay for the hybrid model to be implemented. So some in person, some online services. So the strategies that we used were to have one point of contact at each organization that worked really well, that created really warm, welcoming to the new arrivals because of that really well-tuned machine of connecting. Consistent communication was very much a huge part of that project and a very big contributor to the success of it. Additional supports between SPO and SAW to help the clients with especially high needs and barriers, organizational check-ins between the two organizations and with sponsoring groups, joint trainings and outreach efforts that we did together. In terms of successes, we'll list serving 14 newcomers and 8 sponsorship groups as one of the biggest success. And doing that during the COVID year, I think is a success in and of itself. So the feedback from the clients that we received was largely very positive. Another success, more on the strategic level, I guess, is the better coordination between the two agencies. We're still working closely together, and the relationships that have been developed are very much valued, and we're going to take them forward with us. Learning by agencies and staff within those agencies about and within sponsorship groups about each other, making those connections was very important and continues to happen as much as we can, even after the pilot is over. And overall, we received very positive reaction from newcomers and from sponsors, as well as when we polled, when OCASI and ARI polled settlement staff and source staff, the responses were also very positive. So I think I'm done with my part, and over to Lori.
Thank you so much, Anna. We're gonna have Laura as well join us to share her experiences. I'm sorry, my computer decided everything is wrong. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you perfectly.
Okay, so thank you so much also for having me today. My name is Laura Khalil, and I'm the manager of settlement in the YMCA of Southwestern Ontario in Windsor. I'm located in Windsor. And it was actually a great opportunity for us to partner with the ARI leading the pilot project, improving settlement for privately sponsored refugees in Ontario. So the partnership took place between November 2020 and January 2021. Of course, like we had like on our side also the Diocese of London Refugee Ministries as a sponsorship agreement holder here in Windsor, and so we provided the support to almost 29 newcomers who came to Canada as privately sponsored refugees. They were actually a group of I think 7 sponsors that we interviewed, and we were together working throughout this process. So it's actually very similar to what Anna just mentioned in her project. The only thing I think is different is just the amount of time we spent with the newcomers. So basically it was a short time. It was just only to see them at the beginning of their settlement. So we didn't have, we didn't continue the evaluation like they did at the YMCA of Three Rivers. The provision of our settlement support also, it's always been a very good relationship with the SAW here in Windsor, and they are aware of the settlement agencies, and then we were also referred, we were receiving the referrals from the SAW, and they got us. We have this kind of introduction as a settlement agency to the sponsors. So once the introduction has happened, then this is when we're gonna start the processing of having pre-arrival meetings, and then the second stage will be for the post-arrival meetings. Like Anna mentioned, at the pre-arrival meeting, it was a really important meeting. This is when everybody is in the same page. We can put forward the resources that we have as a settlement agency, all the things that we could offer to make sure that we answer the concerns, if there is any need that could happen between like the pre-arrival meeting and the arrival of the newcomers, and even after the arrival of the newcomers. And we had multiple like examples of co-sponsors who called us like asking for housing support, or ask us for education, like a question about the schools where they have to be, looking for housing for the newcomers. And we were able to support, because some information got changed from time to time, especially around COVID. It was really important to have this most up-to-date information that we can share with the co-sponsors. Of course, also the post-arrival meetings, they were very important. And I'm gonna be frank with you, at the initial stages, when we were like in discussion with the SAW and ARI, our partner, from the Diocese of London, they told us, they said, it's really important to have the post-arrival meeting when everybody is going to be on the same table, and when all parties would come together to welcome a new family, answer all the emerging questions, all the concerns, all at one time, and allowing to express their own, my experience say this, my fear is this, or so about having this. So everybody is like sharing their knowledge together in the same meeting. Of course, there will be an interpretation to the client's first language, which is really important. So I emphasize the language of the newcomers to be addressed at the beginning, even if they said that we have good English, but just make sure that someone is coming from, from overseas, and they have expectation. They need to feel like more like this warm welcome is important, I think, in this particular stage. I also wanted to to tell everyone here on the call that this dynamic of a relationship, it added the trust and the consistency. I think in delivering the service, it's really important and to better the outcome of settlement for the newcomers. After that meeting, everybody will leave the post-arrival meeting. Everybody will leave. They know what they have to do, and as as Anna mentioned, that we will discuss also rights and responsibilities and who's doing what. So we all feel that it's like a teamwork. So let us do this part. You can help assist in this part, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, we would assess the newcomers. Basically, it's going to be on a different call. We will make an appointment on the post-arrival meeting. We will do this, make sure that they are aware how to connect with us, and then we will connect with them, help them to access also teams, because some of them, they haven't been able to be introduced. So we will coach them through the process, and we would do the settlement assessment for them. And of course, for us, we do the we value assessment, as we refer to it in our agency. And this is when we also have, to capture all the needs, the goals, the assets and aspiration, co-create a settlement plan, and move on to achieve the goals one by one. From my perspective, in my capacity as a manager in the in our program, I think it's the main it's actually a very common sense to do this type of process, because as I said, it's the consistent way to help newcomers. It's very rewarding at the end. You see, everybody is involved, everybody is getting their share, and then everybody is aware of what are the resources for the newcomers. I actually myself learned a lot through the process in my connection with the SA, and then with the co-sponsors. This was really it was really a reward for, like, I mean, for us to be working in this project. And if I can add that this type of, you know, standardization, like a collaboration or a collective approach that we have and implementation, it's just it's a very supportive a process for everybody, I think, in my opinion. And of course, it will help enhance the experience of the PSRs and the co-sponsors. So everybody is included in the process. So that's actually my my thought for today.
Thank you so much, Laura. I didn't get a chance to properly introduce you because my computer decided to do funny things, but Laura is a manager of settlement at the YMCA of Southwestern Ontario. So thank you very much to Laura and Anna for sharing with us, for sharing their reflection, their experiences with our pilots. If you would like to hear more from folks who were part of the pilots, we have created some videos in collaboration with refugee participants, with settlement workers, sponsors, as well as participants at an organizational level. And we're going to be sharing that link in the chat. So feel free to go. There are 4 videos that are about 4 minutes each, and you get a pretty neat understanding and view of the work that was done collaboratively. So we're going to pause here for some questions. I think it's a good place to pause and take a minute to take some questions, get some clarifications while we're here. We're going to give you a chance to ask questions to our pilot participants. So Laura and Anna have graciously accepted to take some questions if you have questions for them. We'll start with them, and then we'll also take questions more generally about the pilots and the ideas and iterations that led us to have ARI. And Michelle is back.
Yeah, sorry guys, internet troubles, but I'm back. I apologize very much.
No worries.
And I noticed, if it's okay, Barbara, I noticed in the chat, there's a question from Andrea that I think might be well answered by Laura, because I know that at this particular pilot, you worked pretty much exclusively with sponsors who were family members of those who were included in the pilot. So I'm wondering, the question is, were there family linked sponsorships? You know, were they engaged with this process? And she said, I often find the desire to make those connections with family related sponsorships are minimal or harder to facilitate. So if I might suggest if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I actually, I just want to say, like, it was like 2 good things that happened in the pilot, because all the co-sponsors that came like through this pilot, they were previous clients to the YMCA, so they had like previous experience with us being a client themselves. This is one, and second, they were also related to the PSRs. So what happened is that this connection was already, I think, built within the settlement agency as one, but also they were accepting what we are coming from, like in terms of like helping them and then engaging with them. So they were engaged, I'm gonna say, and we didn't face, to be honest, like any objection or anything that's saying that we can't like let you help the client. I mean the PSRs, or it was smooth. I'm gonna say it wasn't hard at all to establish the connection with the co-sponsors, and of course with the PSRs later on. So I don't know if I answered the question, but yeah. So I don't see that was hard to make this connection myself.
Thank you, Laura. Just a reminder to everyone, if we can keep your mics muted while we're exchanging and while you raise your hand when we call on you to unmute, just so we can hear each other a little bit better. We have another question in the chat. If the NARS involved, NARS would stand for newly arrived.
Needs assessment, I believe.
Needs assessment, okay.
Essentially. Yeah, it's a settlement term. It's not my world.
Yeah. Needs assessment and referral.
Yes, involves only the refugee and settlement worker. How does the sponsor become involved in that process and in the plan going forward?
I think, Barbara, I can answer if you
of course, go ahead, Anna.
So this is, Helen, this is actually why we created the Collaborative Action Plan. The Collaborative Action Plan was a document that we discussed together with the SAW and the sponsors groups in the development stage of it, and it covered the needs that usually are covered in the needs assessment. And at that point, the collaborative approach was used to see which part of that agreement, whether the SAW or the SPO or the client or the sponsorship group, take responsibility for which. So literally, I don't know, Michelle, can we share the screen and show the that slide with a copy of the collaborative action plan?
Yeah,
I don't know.
I'll pull it up while you're talking, Anna.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was one way to identify the needs before the client even arrived in Canada. And some of those needs, I mean, everybody knows. It's like Laura was saying, thank you very much for mentioning them in details. Housing, furniture for the household, like income related pieces, finances, and all like language learning, all of those usual needs that are there were discussed prior to the arrival, and agencies or groups were taking responsibility for that. The needs assessment that happened with the client was part of the process, but for two reasons. One, you still need to create that rapport and the trust building with the between the client and the settlement worker, so between the newcomer and the settlement worker and the family that they're supporting. And so for that reason, it was decided that that interaction should happen individually with that person, take out all of the other actors and help that trust building to happen in that meeting. So the hope was to have those meetings in person. They did not happen in person because of COVID. So there were additional challenges around that because everything was done online. But despite it being done online, it was still very successful, and that trust was still built. And the checks in to follow up on the needs and how they were being met were happening regularly with between the settlement worker and the newcomer throughout that year as we were supporting those newcomers. So I hope I answered the question, but yes, we had the two-layer kind of approach to that, to the NARS. One that involved the other parties and one that only involved the newcomer. And I hope I answered that question.
Thank you, Anna. And just to say, you can probably see my screen. This is the collaborative action plan that Anna was talking about, which is a form they developed with Mennonite Central Committee, where they went in great detail. You can see here through different settlement responsibilities, who could take care of what. And we talked more about this in our roundtable last week, and we will share the report that has a link to this as well. If it's okay with you, Barbara, I just also wanted to add like a kind of to Anna's answer that the whole, how the sponsor is involved after the initial needs assessment did differ on different, pilots and among different sponsor groups. And that's something we talked about a bit, that this needs to be a flexible approach where the newcomer is directing and in charge of how things are shared and when as well. So in some cases, in some of the agencies, they would ask the newcomer, do you want us to include the sponsor in this email? Do you want them to, be in the loop about these things? And so it was kind of a individual level decision.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm just going to ask folks to mute themselves if they're not speaking. Otherwise, there's an echo. But we do have Serena Richardson who has their hands raised. So I'll give them a chance to ask their question now.
Thank you. Actually, Michelle just seemed to have answered it.
Okay,
maybe add anything else you wanted to add to that? Because that's what I was curious about. That was one of the biggest, I think, hurdles for sponsors and settlement workers to get over that was identified early on in our roundtable discussions about the privacy issue. So I'd like to hear if there were any settlement worker agencies that did not or could not actually work to the level that the sponsors were expecting. I guess that would be a good feedback, I think. Were the sponsors happy with their level of involvement, I guess?
Thank you, Serena. Who'd like to take that on? Anna, go ahead.
I think I can start, but I would like other people to maybe join in and share their perspectives. I mean, and we always knew, even like this wasn't like we worked with PSRs before as a settlement agency, right? And in the past, they used to come to us at later stages, and that in itself sometimes presented problems, or they sometimes came when there were breakdowns of that relationship with the sponsors, right? So I mean, yes, I mean to say to shy away from saying that there were no problems. Obviously, we cannot say that, but we felt like with that model, by being introduced to the newcomer early on and by working together with sponsors, all of these roles and responsibilities were divided and discussed in the first meeting. What we found out, because we also include, to specifically answer your question, Serena, because of COVID, like initially the plan was to only work with the newcomers, with the new arrivals. So there was supposed to be a clean cut experiment, like we see everybody, where we do have the pre-arrival meeting, then we have the post-arrival meeting. Because of COVID, pivoting happened, and we also decided to include month 13 clients. And with the month 13 clients that were included, we saw the variation of different types of sponsorship groups, if you want, right? So there was a lot of learning for us and for settlement workers included in this project, in terms to say, like, some of the groups were really very involved. And for them, like sometimes even overly involved. Sometimes at month 13, clients were not ready to become independent. They were still struggling with financial literacy. They were still struggling with literacy in general. They were not independent. And that presented unique challenges in and of itself. And then there were also other sponsorships that were completely like from day one, now settlement worker, you can take care of the newcomer, right? So I mean, you see variations there, and it's a huge learning for I think for all of us in trying to support these different scenarios that we've witnessed. I don't know if I answered the question or not, but I tried.
Thank you, Anna. Does anyone else want to add to that answer?
If I can add one small thing here, like in terms of the relationship with the co-sponsors. Before the arrival of the newcomer, of course, there was no need to. I mean, this is when we start like telling them that we are here to help, to support. If you have any question, like feel free to email me, to call me, everything like that. So this is one part. So it's gonna be like making sure that they are aware that we're supporting here. We're not in a competition or any way like close to this. And then after that, when the client arrives, and then we have this conversation, it's gonna be just general conversation. That this is what we're gonna do, this is how we're gonna help, etc. Basically, after that, when we do the assessment at the Y, like we were able to provide them with the settlement plan, and we will explain the settlement plan one by one. I mean, like a referral, like where they have to go, etc., etc. And then the client, they have the ownership to what they're gonna be doing, and then this is when they can talk to the sponsor, they can share with them if they want to go, for example, to apply for a social insurance number, or they want to apply for health card. They need someone to take them there. Okay. So, for example, the conversation that sometimes happen that the co-sponsor will call us and say like, so is the office open because of COVID? Like, because they told me that I have to take the family, etc., etc. What do you suggest? Like, which bank it's close to whatever. So something like that, and then we know that the conversation already happened between around the subject. So if it's like a normal way of conversation, this is when we say yes. And we had, for example, a case when the co-sponsor asked about which, like, is it like public or the Catholic, or which school it should be for the kids. And we said, like, we cannot discuss this unless the parents are okay with us doing this. Like, this is when we bring it back to the, we need everybody to be involved. If they have to, you have to take them, but they have to decide which way to go. So bring it back to the concept that everybody needs, what they need to know, where to, to direct the conversation, who's responsible and who's like should be helping.
Thank you, Laura. Michelle, Kaylee, I don't know if you're raising your hand or yes. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I got lazy to find the virtual hand. I think I wanted to add in one piece. Hi, everyone. I work with MCC and got to be a part of this pilot. And I think that the navigating of confidentiality is, as Anna shared so eloquently, was definitely something that we worked through. I think part of what we noted and learned was that there was a natural dynamic that took place where, as a SAW representative, most of our conversation focused on communicating with the sponsors. And as a settlement worker, most of their communication focused on communicating directly with the newcomers. And with the relationship that we built together as SAW rep and settlement worker, we were able to navigate whenever challenges came about through the relationship that we developed over the phone, navigating that confidentiality in a way such that we could prioritize when a group meeting needed to take place, and both of the clients that we were supporting needed to come together. And so that kind of behind the scenes conversations that took place as facilitators of the sponsorships and kind of co-case managers really helped in navigating some of those dynamics. But that was more of kind of a natural reality of how communication flowed.
Thank you, Kaylee. We're going to stop here for questions just because I want us to make sure that we get through the presentation. We talk about the recommendations. We have another section for discussion and questions later on, and we'll answer, I think there's one question in the chat from Helen that we'll circle back to. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again, so give me a moment. Share. Wonderful. Based on our work with the pilots, we have 4 recommendations for IRCC. We had the opportunity to present these recommendations to a group of about 50 staff members from IRCC last week, and they were very keen to engage with the recommendations and the content that we're sharing with you today. These recommendations will lead into a section we've called From Ideas to Action, in which we want to share more details about what these recommendations could look like in practice. So going from ideas to action, hence the name. So our first recommendation is to create a policy of intentional connection practice for pre-post arrival coordination to ensure refugees have the support they need. What does this mean? As explained earlier, this is the idea of the intentional connection practice with its 3 stages. So a pre-arrival meeting, either virtually or in person, between a dedicated settlement worker and a sponsor group representative to gather context and share information. A post-arrival meeting in person or virtually between the settlement worker, a sponsor representative, and the refugee to assess needs and coordinate support. And then, of course, a 3rd stage, ongoing and representative settlement services for the refugee as needed, with a single point of settlement information, a single point of contact for settlement information and support for both refugees and their sponsors. Recommendation 2, we're recommending that IRCC supports SPOs and SAWs to create formal partnerships. Through our pilots, these partnerships took the form of MOUs that clarified roles and responsibility, detailed joint activities, and defined how information would be shared between those 3 partners, sorry. It's a 3-way collaboration. Recommendation 3. Encourage SPOs to include sponsors and SAWs as full partners in information exchange opportunities. Just like the knowledge exchange pilot, we would see IRCC encourage and fund SPOs to include sponsors and SAWs in community events and ensure refugees and sponsors are co-creators for those events and share their experience and knowledge. Our fourth recommendation to IRCC is to further define and test the intentional connection practice in order to scale it up. All of our partners told us that they would maintain most of the added pieces by ARI and continue their collaboration work. That being said, we recognize that before scaling up, the practice needs to be tested further and in different conditions, because we did have the conditions of global pandemic. This practice needs to be tested with a larger sample size in different regions of Canada, in rural communities, with grassroots and community-based organizations and small SAWs, and also with G5s and community sponsors. There are some policy gaps that remain. So we have questions, for example, on how can sponsors work with SPOs when they're not set up and funded to do so. We'll talk a little bit more in the next, talk a little bit more about it in the next section.
Great, thank you, Barbara. So now the moment you've all been waiting for. I see there was a question in the chat. Okay, great, but how do we put this into action? So this is where we get to the practical stuff. So we just shared with you our recommendations directly directed at IRCC, Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada. But we wanted to give actionable items to not only the government, but also to yourselves as settlement agencies, as sponsorship agreement holders, and as individuals about how you could really put these recommendations into practice. So today we're going to share a few of those, both the big ideas. These are things that could be implemented maybe in the intermediate term that might require a bit more funding or planning. And then there are the small fixes, which are things that could be done right away to put these recommendations into practice. Really, these kind of small changes that you could make to bring this into life. And before we jump in, we just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the amazing work that's already happening in the sector among sponsors, settlement agencies, SAWs, and more who are actually doing this work on the ground already. Some of these actions we're suggesting are already taking place in different ways. And so we want to acknowledge that and say that, these are our suggestions about how you could put these recommendations into action based on what we learned. And it's really more to kind of regularize this collaboration in practice. So with that, we're going to jump into our first kind of stakeholder, if you will, which is policymakers. I know we probably don't have a lot of policymakers on the call. I think we have a few. And so we think this is also important kind of context for all of you about what we're suggesting, and it might impact your work. The first thing is allow information sharing with sponsors to be a fundable service for SPOs. This really refers to the fact that there's a continued disconnect experienced by those who are trying to collaborate in this sector. Sponsors are told to reach out to settlement workers during settlement planning, which is pre-arrival, or if they have questions. But many settlement agencies don't have the structure or the funding to work with sponsors. They're not able to count this time. I want to acknowledge that many settlement agencies and sponsors have found workarounds to make this work for them, but we are recommending this change so it's more regularized and not just, working off the side of your desk as a settlement agency to work with sponsors. The second point is to fund SPOs to be a hub for referrals for refugees and their sponsors, including one point of contact for sponsor inquiries. Especially for sponsors who might not have a SAW, so like a group of 5 or community sponsors, they have told me that, finding a settlement agency that's able to support them has been one of the barriers they face. And they've had to, call around and trying to find an agency that is able to work with them. And so this is, one suggestion that's been made, that it could be maybe more streamlined so that sponsors know exactly where to get that referral and information. Especially in some locations in Canada, it might make more sense than others. So this might be a regional approach. The next big idea is to allow flexibility in funding agreements with settlement agencies so they can support rural sponsors and refugees virtually and include SAWS and sponsors in their community programming. I see actually on the call a researcher I know is doing work on this in rural areas with rural sponsors. And it definitely came up, especially in our Immigrant Services Kingston area pilot, that, you know, having that flexibility to expand the catchment area so you can serve rural sponsors, or just having more flexibility in being able to work with sponsors and events as well would be really helpful. Lastly, work with SAWS to enhance their capacity to provide post-arrival support for sponsors and refugees. As we mentioned earlier, you know, SAWS don't always have excess staff capacity to build these partnerships. I don't have to tell you that if you're a SAW on this call. And so while IRCC does not directly fund SAWS, we think that IRCC has a role to play in supporting, you know, their work. One example is through what we did, which is indirect funding for SAWS, like through partnerships, or, you know, giving capacity to like networks and other organizing bodies who can actually help SAWS and sponsors put this work into action. In terms of small fixes, we have a few suggestions for IRCC. One is around messaging, ensuring that the messaging is a lot more clearer about the relationship that should exist between sponsors and SAWS. SAWS and settlement agencies. The messaging currently says that like settlement agencies are available to you as a sponsor, right? But they don't provide specific information directly to refugees and sponsors on how to access settlement. And the belief still exists that sponsored refugees don't necessarily need to access these services. There's basically room for clearer communication about that relationship from the government directly. The last point here, encourage SPOs to include sponsors and SAWS as key players in service provision while maintaining confidentiality. We talked about that earlier, but what that means in practice, small changes could make a difference in this. So for example, settlement workers could ask sponsored refugees when they know they're a sponsored refugee in the course of their regular intake, do you want your sponsors present at this first meeting? Or how do you want them to be in the loop, if at all, right? It's something small, but seeing that sponsor as an ally and really treating them as part of that ecosystem of support for that newcomer could really go a long way. And you don't even have to make big changes to policy to be able to do that, just these small fixes. So that's for policymakers. Now let's break it down. We're going next to SAWS. And when we talk about SAWS, we're also referring, say you're a sponsor group, say you are, you know, or you're a repeat sponsor. This could apply to sponsor groups in general, as well as SAWS. Our first suggestion is, unsurprisingly, maybe consider building a partnership with a settlement agency. You know, reaching out to a local SPO, it could be something really simple that you just agree to, you know, collaborate on referrals. It could also be more involved, like, you know, asking that agency to join your events, or, you know, answering questions if you as a SAW have questions, right? If, for example, you know, it's tax time, it has been tax time, what if you have questions about that? Can you go to them, right? So there's a few ways you could think about that partnership. And you'll see here we have an example of the MOU template. I'm going to show that really quickly. So, you know, this is a very simple tool. Here we go, share. This is a simple tool based on the MOU that one of our pilot agencies shared with us. It's just to really visualize, like when you have an agreement like this MOU, you can agree on certain activities and how you're going to share information up front. So obviously it talks about roles and responsibilities, what each agency is agreeing to do. Is it intake? Is it, you know, you'll have a joint orientation session once a year? It's up to you. Obviously, you know, having your terms and conditions about sharing information is super important. And having a work plan, you know, is going to help you stay on track and set those goals, and reviewing it because things change. And so we have shared, I think in the chat, we're sharing this tool that you could download and use yourself if you want a place to start from. So the other point here, facilitate an early and automatic referral of sponsors to a SPO. This is obviously something that could be regularized. And if it's something as a SAW, maybe you don't have the capacity to do this for all of the sponsorships, you could concentrate on certain, groups that might benefit more. We saw that, this was particularly helpful for refugees who were maybe more high needs, who had maybe challenges such as barriers in terms of literacy, right? Or first-time sponsors. So maybe as a first-time sponsor, you need that extra help and orientation to services. So that's another way you could think about, using your limited capacity to have a maximum impact in partnerships. Small fixes for SAWs. Invite settlement staff to your events. It's simple, but it's not only about sharing information, but making a personal connection to that settlement agency and even to a settlement worker. We saw that building that relationship takes time, but it's the personal level of relationship that can really have big dividends, that as you as a SAW have an understanding and oh, I go to so-and-so for this question, it can really facilitate that building of trust to be able to work better together. And extra support for SAWs and sponsors to facilitate partnership building. This was mentioned earlier in the policy section, but it's worth noting that we understand that extra support might be needed to be able to put some of this into action, and that maybe some bodies such as RSTP or the SAW navigation unit or others might have a role to play perhaps in facilitating these partnerships or advising SAWs or sponsors on how they could put this into action. Now, our last stakeholder that I'm going to talk about, settlement providing organizations. So in terms of what is a big idea, we've already talked about partnerships. We do encourage you to consider a partnership, but we also wanted to talk about events. So a lot of settlement agencies do events already. You have events that you put out into the world where you talk about your services. But what we tested with our knowledge exchange pilot was not just information, but a true exchange of knowledge that can take place when we acknowledge the experience of sponsors, of newcomers themselves, of community members, that it's a whole of community approach and really, taking it from that approach. And we have another tool I'm going to share with you that, we used in our pilot. Sharing screen, share. This is our event checklist. It's super basic, where you just, as you're planning, you go through this checklist to ask, do we have the right people, sharing with lived experience, with expertise on the topic? How are we going to encourage true dialogue and sharing of resources? So this is another tool that we hope you might consider using, so that it's not just, a one-sided conversation, but really enhances dialogue, because we feel there's a need for continued dialogue and connection on this level between all of these stakeholders. The second point, consider these recommendations in tandem with efforts to streamline intake of newcomers through a centralized process. We know that across Canada, there's different efforts to think about how all newcomers access services, how all of them are welcomed, whether it's sponsored refugees, all newcomers and immigrants to this country. And so we hope that you can, use some of what we learned to consider what it looks like to have that welcoming approach that considers newcomers not only as a client, but also their surrounding kind of support systems like sponsors or others, and can kind of see that holistically. For small fixes, we have a few small suggestions. Pardon me. Train settlement workers on the PSR program, and beyond that, specifically on the role of sponsors in settlement. So I want to give a special shout out to RSTP if they're on the call, and Catholic Cross Cultural Services, we worked together to do a training, a number of trainings actually, for more than 150 settlement workers on the PSR program this past year. And there was a great appetite, like people really wanted these trainings. But it's not just about the program. You know, there's a need to educate settlement workers on the role of sponsors, on valuing what it is that sponsors bring, and understanding on a practical level how each has a unique and important role in settlement. And we have examples that we're sharing of our training slides, so you can see how it is that we broke it down, and we'd really encourage this to be a regular thing you do with your staff. State on the SPO website that the agency is open to sponsor questions and suggest one person, email, or number to contact. Now, this might seem really obvious, and maybe some of you are already doing this, but a lot of sponsors outside of the pilots talk to me about how, you know, it's not always clear to them where they can go to connect in. Many of them talk about experience of calling settlement agencies and not knowing who to speak to, not knowing if they're open to speaking to the sponsors. So this is just the smallest thing you can do to say, we're open to you, here's how you contact us, and it's going to make a huge difference in enhancing your collaboration with sponsors in your communities. So those are all of our practical tips. I see there's lots of chat, so I'm so excited to get into some discussion with you all, because yeah, this is complex, this is ongoing, and these are some suggestions we are hoping that you will engage with and take on. So yeah, more is available in, I'll just quickly say, more is available in our report. This is something that, you know, we just launched last week with all of the information, all the tools we just mentioned. We encourage you to download it, share it, and use these tools in your work as much as you'd like. And we will share it again. If you don't get it in the chat, you can share it again. You can get it again in the email that we'll be sending after this roundtable. So thank you, and off to Barbara.
Just before we move on to the next section, I just wanted to let folks know who the link for the CAP form that was sent earlier in the chat. I know some folks had some difficulty accessing it or downloading it, and I think we figured out what's going on. The form is being downloaded directly to your download folder, so you can find it over there. If you go in there, you'll find it. I know it's opening browser windows a little bit funny, but if you go into your folder, it'll be there. We'll also make sure to share it in the email that comes later.
Yes, sorry, it's in a Word document because we wanted you to be able to engage with it as much as possible. So yeah, sorry about that.
Awesome. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because we're at our second question period. I know we have some questions in the chat. I know the presentation itself might have brought in some more questions. So we're going to take some time right now to answer your questions. Did we want to start with the ones in the chat? I don't see any raised hands. So I'll start with the ones in the chat, and I'll try and find I know we had one question left over from the previous.
Yes, I think from Helen.
Mm-hmm. Sponsors already have a settlement plan that they are required to complete as part of their sponsorship application. Does this plan feed into the plan which comes out of the NAARS and the post-arrival collaboration? So who would like to answer? I think this is from our discussion on the plans. So Anna, would you like to start?
I can try, I can have first go. So yes, the sponsoring group has its assessment of their own on the plan, and the same way the settlement agency has their own needs assessment, the NARS that you've mentioned. And yes, I mean, the needs are pretty much the same. So it's more about the collaboration part and more about discussing who is going to take care of which part of that of the need, right? So in the document that Michelle shared with everybody, the collaborative action plan, it's actually divided, like I have it in front of me. It's like who is taking the lead on what, who is the support for that. And you know exactly, because you have that one point of contact at the organization, you know exactly where you go to if you're struggling with that, right? So if you say, for example, that finding housing is something that the sponsorship group takes responsibility for, they can still go to a settlement worker to see if what's available, what do they recommend, which agency referrals they can make, or if it's finding a doctor, you can also ask a settlement worker because we have connections. But then, for example, the region of Waterloo, we might know who is accepting new patients, right? But it's still the main responsibility of the sponsor to do that, and vice versa, like depending on the need. And it's and the beauty of the document is that there's discussion about it, and then there's the collective decision as to who is taking charge of what, and then there's monitoring throughout the year in our case of the pilot as to has this been done or not, if there needs to be follow-up, if the client needs still to be supported in that area, then that support is provided, but everybody's on the same page following that document.
If I could add on to that, Anna, definitely something that we saw is that sponsors don't want additional documents to fill, right? I mean, obviously they're very busy, and this is a challenge that we face because we really wanted to take the time to make sure we went through roles and responsibilities in a way. And so we had to balance those kind of, wanting to share information and not be overburdensome. To answer your point, in a way, the settlement plan that sponsors fill, I mean, I personally have worked with a settlement agency for many years, and that settlement plan is for the sponsors, right? It's for their personal planning to receive the newcomer. The needs assessment is going to be for the newcomer directly, so they are different, but it's not black and white because, once the newcomer arrives, anyone wants to add on the call who's a sponsor, you're always revising that plan. You're making, you're adding to it, right? And so there is a give and take in that moment once the newcomer arrives. So I think hopefully that answers a bit of the question.
Laura, if you'd like to add. Thanks.
Yeah, I would like to add something actually from the perspective of the NARS, because when we do the assessment or when we do the initial needs assessment, we call it at the Y, we call it needs assets, and it needs assets and capacities for the clients. When we see them, it's not only from the needs base, it's more than from the capacity base. If I'm gonna say to be more straight to the point, we don't want to also just focus on what do they need in terms of problems, or they have this health issues, or what other things that they can bring, and then capture this and then make the goals, and then to ask them about their aspiration, what they want to do in the future, the education goals, etc. So all this could be captured from the NARS, but I haven't seen, to be honest, the actual plan for the sponsor. But basically, from what was explained, it's mostly the immediate needs, I'm going to be calling them, more than what the client themselves needs today and tomorrow and in the future. And
Thank you so much. I hope that answers the question for Helen. We have an earlier question, and I'm not sure what specifically it was referring to, from Bruyarma. How would this be implemented? Guidelines, contractual agreements, key performance indicators? I don't know. I think we answered some of those questions as the presentation went, but I want to give that person an opportunity to ask for clarification or to be more specific in their question. Is that person still with us?
Yeah, Mario here.
Hi, Mario.
Yeah, I work for the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development, so on the provincial side. And just in terms, it's of, if funding is going to be provided, to an SPO to basically make sure, that those best practices, are, there's some kind of accountability framework right there, some reporting obligations, so there could be some, and I guess that would be probably within sort of a schedule, so the transfer payment agreement, you will have connected with so many sponsors, delivered so many sessions, etc.
Thank
I was
you,
just
Mario.
wondering, so from a bureaucratic point of view, so how that could possibly transfer, so in something that's measurable, and reportable.
Mm.
So some thinking for you to do, basically, it's like as bureaucrats may ask you those questions.
No, it's a great question, Mario. I'm going to give our group the chance to answer, and then maybe we can go forward for more clarification if needed. Michelle, did you want to start?
I think our pilot partners might be
Yeah.
better familiar with reporting. I would just say that in our recommendation about it being funded, I mean, we have not, implemented this as a regular course of programming, right? So I think that our recommendation is to continue to test and scale this up, and those questions would have to be addressed, absolutely. But I'm going to pause there maybe and see if others have a different perspective.
If I understood correctly, it's a matter of how we are reporting this to our funder, the whole process. If I understood correctly, so what for us, it was a fairly short time. I'm gonna say it was about maybe 2 months and a half, kind of. This is when we collected. I mean, we did the assessments, and we continue our however, it didn't change anything in our reporting. The only thing that this is the normal NAR that was reported in iCare, and everything went smoothly the way it is for any other client. The only thing we can we saw that it's an opportunity for us to learn more from how we can support better, how we can enhance our service, because at the end we want to build this connection as quickly at the beginning of at the initial stage of settlement, because it has better outcome at the end. So that was the goal, and we could just definitely write about it in the iCare. I mean, sorry, write about it in the reporting for IRCC, just to make sure that they're aware of this project. And yeah, so that's for me.
So I can just add a little bit to that. So in terms of reporting to IRCC, I'm sure a lot of people know that already. So what we're reporting on a monthly basis is the number of needs assessments that we did, the number of information and orientation sessions that we did. So I don't know, I'm not in the position to be suggesting how to measure that, but it might be even measured within those information orientation sessions. But right now, currently, we're only funded to do information orientation sessions with the newcomer client themselves. It's all based on the UCI numbers, and it has to be an eligible IRCC eligible client at the moment. And we recorded those clients that were covered in the pilot project as IRCC eligible clients. So in fact, they are. That small pool of clients is part of that reporting too. But the time that we've spent with the sponsors and the time that we've spent with the SAW is not something that is covered by any of the funding other than the pilot funding in our case.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I hope that answers your question, Mario. We have a few questions and comments in the chat still, and I know we also have another section that we wanted to talk a little bit about. So do we want to take one more question and then move on to the discussion, just because of time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that Kaylee responded to a question in the chat. But maybe you want to take that, Barbara?
Yep. Sorry, the chat is
chat's busy,
which is wonderful. So I think there was a question from Barbara. I'm just trying to find it. If you have it on hand.
Yeah, sorry. Barbara was wondering if this dilutes the roles of sponsors at all. And I think there's also a question about potential confusion around sponsors, saying they're going to do a role and then settlement ends up taking it. So maybe, Kaylee, you've answered it in the chat, but I don't know if you or Stephanie both worked with us as a SAW. So I wonder maybe if you have a perspective to share on that.
Sure, I can start, and then Anna and Steph, feel free to jump in. I think this is a great question, Barbara, and the other person who raised just the role confusion. And that's definitely something that we encountered the majority of our sponsors that participated in the pilot, and maybe this was shared earlier and I missed it, but they did communicate that this was helpful to their experience and helped strengthen, help them lead out in their strengths and have a clear go-to person in addition to their SAW rep to navigate settlement challenges in the post-arrival space. The CAP form that was shared, as Anna was speaking to earlier, we did have a differentiation between the lead versus the support. And that was an update that we made halfway through because we did encounter confusion by some of our sponsors in not fully understanding who was taking the lead and who should be supporting and who was responsible to actually make this work, make this task get to completion. So that was the iteration we made to the form. And I think the other thing that I added is that each sponsorship group is unique and each sponsorship group has different strengths. So if you are a sponsorship group who has been doing this for years, who has a lot of experience in applying for child tax benefit forms and figuring out who the doctor in town is that has availability, then go for it. And a lot of our sponsors take the lead and make those things happen and require very little support from settlement workers. But the reality is that not all sponsorship groups are that way. And so we found that our sponsorship groups who didn't have that experience really did appreciate having that settlement worker there to support them. So yeah, the CAP form iteration of clearly identifying who's the lead and who's the support came out of our experience of some role confusion.
Thank you, Kaylee. Did you want to add anything, Anna? Bill, I will. You'll be the next question, I promise. Or did you want to add a comment to this? No, a question. Okay, awesome. Okay. I hope that answers your question, Barbara. Bill, would you like to ask your question? Oh, Bill, we can't hear you.
Okay, being rather new to this field, I feel like somebody who's trying to learn how to swim and have jumped into the deep end by mistake. So I was curious to know, in the email that you're going to be sending out, might you be including those screens that talked about big ideas and small fixes, so I could bring some information back to my group that perhaps they can figure out a lot more than I can? Because I haven't been able to capture all of those screens because they've changed before I had completely finished one screen and a new one popped up. So I would like to bring that information back to my group if I could.
Absolutely. So we are sharing a report, and that has all of the big fixes, big ideas and small fixes, and all of the information that you would need to share with your sponsor group. And we'll be sharing that through email after the session. So you'll have that ready to go to share. Thank
you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us. Awesome. We're fast running out of time. So we just want to quickly wrap up the session and tell you how you can reach us. So I'll share my screen very quickly.
Yes, Bill, you jumped the gun there. We definitely are going to be sharing information with you all. This is how you can reach Barbara and I. We have a newsletter, but that we are wrapping up. This is our final few weeks of the project. So thank you for being part of this roundtable where we got to kind of wrap up our findings and recommendations for the future. But you're welcome to be in touch. We will share the report and the recording with all of you afterwards. And we would like to yet again say thank you to our funder, Immigration, Refugees, Citizenship Canada, for making this whole project possible. And thank you also to folks on the call. I see some familiar people who are part of our advisory, part of the pilots, and some of you I remember being at collaborative design sessions with, a few years ago. So it's really cool to see how it came from, research to pilot testing and beyond. We hope that This learning will live on in the work that you do every day. And we're happy to share any more information we can with you if you wish. So please do be in touch. And thank you for your time today. It was really great to spend some time digging into these findings on a policy and organizational level. Barbara, anything else I missed?
No, I think you've captured it all. Our emails and information are in the chat, so feel free to reach out, and we will be sending a follow-up email with all of the information you might need and all of the more detailed information about the session.
Yes, and thanks to Laura and Anna.
Yes,
really great
so
job at sharing what you did and the great work you did. All right, bye everyone.